Chapter 36 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 36. The Discovery of Life. This is the letter which Swinnerton Loughbourne received over the signature of Dr. Randall Byron. It was such a strange letter that between paragraphs Swinnerton Loughbourne paced up and down his Gramercy Park studio and stared, baffled, at the heights of the Metropolitan Tower. Dear Swinnerton, I'll be with you in good old Manhattan about as soon as you get this letter. I am sending this ahead because I want you to do me a favor. If I have to go back to those bare, blank rooms of mine, with the smell of chemicals drifting in from the laboratory, I'll get drunk. That's all. Here Swinnerton Loughbourne lowered the letter to his knees and grasped his head in both hands. Next he turned to the end of the letter and made sure that the signature was Randall Byron. He stared again at the handwriting. It was not the usual script of the young doctor. It was bolder, freer, and twice as large as usual. There was a total lack of regard for the amount of stationery consumed. Shaking his head in bewilderment, Swinnerton Loughbourne shook his fine gray head and read on. What I want you to do is to stir about and find me a new apartment. Mind you, I don't want the loft of some infernal arcade building in the 60s. Get me a place somewhere between 30th and 58th. 2 bedrooms. I want a place to put some of the boys when they drop around my way. And at least 1 servant's room. Also, at least 1 large room where I can stir about and wave my arms without hitting the chandelier. Are you with me?" Here Swinnerton Loughbourne seized his head between both hands again and groaned. Dementia, plain and simple dementia, and at his age, poor boy. He continued, "Find an interior decorator. Not one of those fuzzy-haired women in pants, but a he-man who knows what a he-man needs. Tell him I want that place furnished regardless of expense. I want some deep chairs that will hit me under the knees. I want some pictures on the wall, but nothing out of the 18th century, no impressionistic landscapes, no girls dolled up in fluffy stuff. I want some pictures I can enjoy, even if my maiden aunt can't. There you are. Tell him to go ahead on those lines. In a word, Swinnerton, old top, I want to live. For about 30 years I've thought, and now I know that there's nothing in it. All the thinking in the world won't make 1 more blade of grass grow, put 1 extra pound on the ribs of a longhorn, and in a word, thinking is the bunk, pure and simple." At this point Swinnerton Loughbourne staggered to the window, threw it open, and leaned out into the cold night. After a time he had strength enough to return to his chair and read through the rest of the epistle without interruption. "You wonder how I've reached this new viewpoint? Simply by seeing some concentrated life here at the Cumberland Ranch. My theories are blasted and knocked in the head, praise God, and I've brushed a million cobwebs out of my brain. Chemistry? Rot. There's another sort of chemistry that works on the inside of a man. That's what I want to study. There are 3 great preliminary essentials to the study. First, how to box with a man. Second, how to talk with a girl. Third, how to drink old wine. Try the 3, Swinnerton. They aren't half bad. At first they may give you a sore jaw, an aching heart, and a spinning head, but in the end they teach you how to keep your feet and fight. This is how my eyes were opened. When I came out to this ranch it was hard for me to ride a horse, so I've been studying how it should be done. Among other things, you should keep your toes turned in, you know, and there are many other things to learn. When I had mastered them 1 by 1, I went out the other day and asked to have a horse saddled. It was done, and a lantern-jawed cowpuncher brought out a piebald gelding with long ears and sleepy eyes. Not a lovely beast, but a mild one. So I went into the saddle according to theory, with some slight hesitation here and there, planted my feet in the stirrups, and told the lantern-jawed fellow to turn loose the head of the piebald. This was done. I shook the reins. The horse did not move. I called to the brute by name. One ear wagged back to listen to me. I kicked the beast in the ribs. Unfortunately, I had forgotten that long spurs were on my heels. The horse was instantly aware of that fact, however. He leaped into a full gallop, a very jolty process. Then he stopped, but I kept on going. A fence was in the way, so I was halted. Afterwards, the lantern-jawed man picked me up and offered to carry me back to the house, or at least get a wheelbarrow for me. I refused with some dignity. I remarked that I preferred walking, really, and so I started out across the hills and away from the house. My head was sore, so were my shoulders where I hit the fence. I began to think of the joy of facing that horse again, armed with a club. It was evening, after supper, you see, and the light of the moon was already brighter than the sunlight, and by the time I had crossed the first range of hills it was quite dark. As I walked I brooded upon many things. There were enough to disturb me. There was old Joe Cumberland at death's door and beyond the reach of my knowledge, and he had been taken away from death by the wild man, Dan Barry. There was the girl with the bright hair, Kate Cumberland. In education, nothing. In brain, nothing. In experience, nothing. And yet I was attracted. But she was not attracted in the least until along came the wild man again, and then she fell into his arms, actually fought for him. Why? I could not tell. My name and the things I have done, and even my money, meant nothing to her. But when he came, it was only a glance, a word, a smile, and she was in his arms. I felt like Caligula. I wished the world had only one neck, and I an axe. But why should I have felt depressed because of failures in the eyes of these silly yokels? Not one of them could read the simplest chemical formula. All very absurd, you will agree, and you may get some inkling as to my state of mind while I walked over those same dark hills. I seemed a part of that darkness. I looked up to the stars. They were merely like the pages of a book. I named them offhand, one after the other, and thought of their characteristics, their distances, their composition, and meditated on the marvels the spectrum has made known to us. But no sooner did such a train of thought start in my brain than I again recurred to the girl, Kate Cumberland, and all I was aware of was a pain at heart, something like homesickness. Very strange. She and the man are together constantly. The other day I was in Joseph Cumberland's room, and we heard whistling outside. The face of the old man lighted. "They are together again," he said. "How do you guess at that?" I asked. "By the sound of his whistling," he answered. For he whistles as if he expected an answer, as if he were talking with someone. And by the Lord, the old man was right. It would never have occurred to me. Now as I started down the farther slope of a hill, a whistling sound ran upon me through the wind, and looking back I saw a horseman galloping with great swiftness along the line of the crest, very plainly outlined by the sky, and by something of the smoothness in the running of the horse I knew that it was Barry and his black stallion. But the whistling, the music, dear God, man, have you read of the pipes of Pan? That night I heard them, and it made a riot in my heart. He was gone suddenly, and the whistling went out like a light, but something had happened inside me. The first beginning of this process of internal change. The ground no longer seemed so dark. There were earth smells, very friendly. I heard some little creature chirruping contentedly to itself. Something hummed, a grasshopper perhaps. And then I looked up to the stars. There was not a name I could think of. I forgot them all, and for the first time I was contented to look at them and wonder at their beauty without an attempt at analysis or labeling. If I say that I went back to the ranch house with my feet on the ground and my heart up there among the stars, will you understand? I found the girl sewing in front of the fire in the living room. Simply looked up to me with a smile and a certain dimness about the eyes. Well, my breath stopped. "Kate," said I am going away tomorrow morning." "And leave Dad?" said she. "To tell you the truth," I answered, "there is nothing I can do for him. There has never been anything I could do for him." "I am sorry," said she, and lifted up her eyes to me. Now, I had begun by being stiff with her, but the ringing of that whistling, pipes of Pan, you know, was in my ears. I took a chair beside her. Something overflowed in my heart. For the first time in whole days I could look on her beauty without pain. "Do you know why I'm going?" I asked. She waited. "Because," said I, and smiled right into her face, "I love you, Kate, most infernally, and I know perfectly well that I will get never the devil a bit of good out of it." She peered at me. "You aren't jesting," says she. "No, you're serious." "I'm very sorry, Dr. Byron." "And I answered, am glad. I wouldn't change it for the world. For once in my life, tonight, I have forgotten myself. No, I won't go away and nurse a broken heart. But I'll think of you as a man should think of something bright and above him. You'll keep my heart warm, Kate, till I'm a very old man. Because of you, I'll be able to love some other girl, and a fine one, by the Lord." Something in the nature of an outburst, huh? But it was the music which had done it. All the time it rang and echoed through my ears. My words were only an echo of it. I was in tune with the universe. I was living for the first time. The girl dropped her sewing, tossed it aside. She came over to me and took my hands in a way that would have warmed even the icicles of your heart, Swinnerton. "Doctor," says she, "I know that you are going to be very happy." "Happiness," said I, "is a trick like riding a horse, and I think that I've learned the trick. I've caught it from you and from Barry." At that she let go my hands and stepped back. "The very devil is in these women, Swinnerton. You can never place them for a minute at a time." "I'm trying to learn myself," she said, and there was a shadow of wistfulness in her eyes. In another moment I should have made a complete fool of myself, but I remembered in time and got out of the room. "Tomorrow I start back for the old world, but I warn you beforehand, my dear fellow, that I'm bringing something of the new world with me. What has it all brought to me? I am sad one day and gay the next, but at least I know that thinking is not life, and now I'm ready to fight." Randall Byron. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 37. The Piebald. The morning of the doctor's departure witnessed quite a ceremony at the Cumberland ranch, for old Joe Cumberland insisted that he be brought down from his room to his old place in the living room. When he attempted to rise from his bed, however, he found that he could not stand, and big Buck Daniels lifted the old man like a child and carried him down the stairs. Once ensconced on the sofa in the living room, Joe Cumberland beckoned his daughter close to him, and whispered with a smile as she leaned over, "Here's what comes of pretending, Kate. I've been pretending to be too sick to walk, and now I can't walk, and if I'd pretended to be well, I'd be riding Satan right now." He looked about him. "Where's Dan?" he asked. "Upstairs getting ready for the trip." "Trip?" "He's riding with Dr. Byron to town, and he'll bring back Dr. Byron's horse." The old man grew instantly anxious. "They's a lot of things can happen on a long trip like that, Kate." She nodded gravely. "But we have to try him," she said. "We can't keep him here at the ranch all the time, And if he really cares, Dad, he'll come back." "And you let him go of your own free will?" asked Joe Cumberland wonderingly. "I asked him to go," she answered quietly, but some of the colour left her face. "Of course it's going to come out all right," nodded the father. "I asked him when he'd be back, and he said he would be here by dark tomorrow night." The old man sighed with relief. "He don't never slip up on promises," he said. "But oh, lass, I'll be glad when he's back again. Buck, how'd you and Dan come along together?" "We don't come," answered Buck gloomily. "I tried to shake hands with him yesterday and call it quits, but he wouldn't touch me. He just leaned back and smiled at me and hated me with his eyes, that way he has. He don't even look at me except when he has to, and when he does I feel like someone was sneaking up behind me with a knife ready. And he ain't said 10 words to me since I come back." He paused and considered Kate with the same dark, lowering glance. "Tomorrow I leave." "You'll think better of that," nodded Joe Cumberland. "Here's the doctor now." He came in with Dan Barry behind him. A changed man was the doctor. He was a good 2 inches taller because he stood so much more erect, and there was a little spring in his step which gave aspiration and spirit to his carriage. He bade them good bye one by one, and by Joe Cumberland he sat down for an instant and wished him luck. The old ranchman drew the other down closer. "They's no luck for me," he whispered, "but don't tell none of 'em. I'm about to take a longer trip than you'll ride today. But first I'll see 'em settle down here. Dan quiet and both of 'em happy. S'long, Doc. Thanks for taking care of me. But this here is something that can't be beat no way. Too many years break the back of any man, Doc. Luck to you." "If you'll step to the door," said the doctor, smiling upon the rest, "you'll have some fun to watch. I'm going to ride on the piebald." "Him that throwed you yesterday?" grinned Buck Daniels. "The same," said the doctor. "I think I can come to a gentleman's understanding with him. A gentleman, from the piebald's point of view, is one who is never unintentionally rude. He may change his mind this morning, or he may break my back. One of the two is sure to happen." In front of the house Dan Barry already sat on Satan, with Black Bart sitting near by watching the face of his master. And beside them the lantern-jawed cowpuncher held the bridle of the piebald mustang. Never in the world was there a lazier appearing beast. His lower lip hung pendulous a full inch and a half below the upper. His eyes were rolled so that hardly more than the whites showed. He seemed to stand asleep, dreaming of some nirvana for equine souls, and the only signs of life were the long ears which wobbled occasionally back and forth. When the doctor mounted, the piebald limited all signs of interest to opening one eye. The doctor clucked. The piebald switched his tail. Satan, at a word from Dan Barry, moved gracefully into a soft trot away from the house. The doctor slapped his mount on the neck. An ear flicked back and forth. The doctor stretched out both legs, and then he dug both spurs deep into the flanks of the mustang. It was a perfectly successful maneuver. The back of the piebald changed from an ugly humped line to a decidedly sharp parabola, and the horse left the ground with all 4 feet. He hit it again, almost in the identical hoof marks, and with all legs stiff. The doctor sagged drunkenly in the saddle, and his head first swung far back and then snapped over so that the chin banged against his chest. Nevertheless, he clung to the saddle with both hands and stayed in his seat. The piebald swung his head around sufficiently to make sure of the surprising fact, and then he commenced to buck in earnest. It was a lovely exhibition. He bucked with his head up and his head between his knees. He bucked in a circle and in a straight line, and then mixed both styles for variety. He made little spurts at full speed, leaped into the air, and came down stiff-legged at the end of the run, his head between his braced forefeet, and then he whirled as if on a peg and darted back the other way. He bucked crisscross, jumping from side to side, and he interspersed this with samples of all his other kinds of bucking thrown in. That the doctor stuck on the saddle was a miracle beyond belief. Of course he pulled leather shamelessly throughout the contest, but riding straight up is a good deal of a myth. Fancy riding is reserved for circus men. The mountain desert is a place where men stick close to utility and let style go hang. And the doctor stuck in the saddle. He had set his teeth, and he was a seasick greenish white. His hat was a jog over one ear. His shirt tails flew out behind, and still he remained to battle. Aye, for he ceased the passive clinging to the saddle. He gathered up the long quirt which had hitherto dangled idly from his wrist, and at the very moment when the piebald had let out another notch in his feats, the doctor, holding on desperately with one hand, and with the other brandished the quirt around his head and brought it down with a crack along the flanks of the piebald. The effect was a little short of a miracle. The mustang snorted and leaped once into the air, but he forgot to come down stiff-legged, and then instantly he broke into a little, soft dog trot and followed humbly in the trail of the black stallion. The laughter and cheers from the house were the sweetest of music in the ears of Dr. Randall Byron. The most sounding sentences of praise from the lips of the most learned of professors after this would be the most shabby of anticlimaxes. He waved his arm back to a group standing in front of the house: Buck Daniels, Kate, the lantern-jawed cowboy, and Wung Lu waving his kitchen apron. In another moment he was beside the rider of the stallion, and the man was whistling one of those melodies which defied repetition. It simply ran on and on, smoothly sweeping through transition after transition, soaring and falling in the most effortless manner. Now it paused, now it began again. It was never loud, but it carried like the music of a bird on wing blown by the wind. There was about it also something which escaped from the personal. He began to forget that it was a man who whistled, and such a man. He began to look about to the hills and the sky and the rocks, for these, it might be said, were set to music. They, too, had the sweep of line and the broken rhythms, the sense of spaciousness, the far horizons. That day was a climax of the unusual weather. For a long time the sky had been periodically blanketed with thick mists, but today the wind had freshened, and it tore the mists into 1,000 mighty fragments. There was never blue sky in sight, only far up a diminishing and lighter gray to testify that above it the yellow sun might be shining. But all the lower heavens were asweep with vast cloud masses, irregular, huge, hurling across the sky. They hung so low that one could follow the speed of their motion and almost gauge it by miles per hour, and in the distance they seemed to brush the tops of the hills. Seeing this, the doctor remembered what he had heard of rain in this region. It would come, they said, in sheets and masses, literal waterfalls. Dry arroyos suddenly filled and became swift torrent, rolling big boulders down their courses. There were tales of men fording rivers who were suddenly overwhelmed by terrific walls of water which rushed down from the higher mountains in masses 4 and 8 feet high. In coming they made a thundering among the hills, and they plucked up full-grown trees like twigs thrust into wet mud. Indeed, that was the sort of rain one would expect in such a country, so whipped and naked of life. Even the reviving rain was sent in the form of a scourge, and that which should make the grass grow might tear it up by the roots. That was a time of change and of portent, and a day well fitted to the mood of Randall Bryan. He also had altered, and there was about to break upon him the rain of life, and whether it would destroy him or make him live, and richly, he could not guess. But he was naked to the skies of chance, naked as this landscape. Far past the midday they reached the streets of Elkhead and stopped at the hotel. As the doctor swung down from his saddle, cramped and sore from the long ride, thunder rattled over the distant hills, and a patter of rain splashed in the dust and sent up a pungent odor to his nostrils. It was like the voice of the earth proclaiming its thirst. And a blast of wind leaped down the street and lifted the brim of Barry's hat and set the bandana at his throat fluttering. He looked away into the teeth of the wind and smiled. There was something so curious about him at that instant that Randall Byron wanted to ask him into the hotel, wanted to have him knee to knee for a long talk. But he remembered the old poem, "The seashell needs the waves of the sea, the bird will not sing in the cage," and the yellow light in the eyes of Barry, phosphorescent almost, a thing that might be nearly seen by night, that surely would not shine under any roof. It was the wind which made him smile. These things he understood without fear. So he said good-bye, and the rider waved carelessly and took the reins of the piebald and turned the stallion back. He noted the cat-like grace of the horse in moving, as if his muscles were steel springs, and he noted also that the long ride had scarcely stained the glossy hide with sweat, while the piebald reeked with the labor. Randall Byron drew thoughtfully back onto the porch of the hotel and followed the rider with his eyes. In a moment a great cloud of dust poured down the street, covered the rider, and when it was gone he had passed around a corner and out of the life of the doctor. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 38. The Challenge. All this time Black Bart had trotted contentedly ahead of Satan, never having to glance back, but apparently knowing the intended direction, save that when Dan Barry turned to the road leading out of the little town, the wolf dog had turned in an opposite direction. The rider turned in the saddle and sent a sharp whistle towards the animal, but he was answered by a short howl of woe that made him check Satan and swing around. Black Bart stood in the center of the street facing in the opposite direction, and he looked back over his shoulder towards his master. There was apparently a perfect understanding between them, and the master first glanced up and made sure of the position of the sun and the length of time he might allow for the trip home before he decided to follow the whim of the wolf dog. Then he turned Satan and cantered, with the piebald trailing, back towards Black Bart. At this the wolf dog began to trot down the street, turned the next corner, and drew up at the door of a rambling building above which hung a dirty, cracked sign, "Gilead Saloon," and underneath in smaller letters was painted the legend, "Here's where you get it." Black Bart strolled up to the swinging doors of the emporium, and then turned to look back at his master. Clearly he wished Dan to enter the place, but the rider shook his head and would certainly have ridden on had not, at that moment, the rain, which had hitherto fallen only in rattling bursts, now burst over the roofs of the town with a loud roaring as of wind through a forest. It was possible that the shower might soon pass over, so Dan rode under the long shelter which stretched in front of the saloon, dismounted, and entered behind Black Bart. It was occupied by a scattering of people, for the busy time of the day had not yet commenced, and Pale Annie was merely idling behind the bar, working at half speed, as it were. To this group Black Bart paid not the slightest heed, but glided smoothly down the center of the long room until he approached the tables at the end, where in a corner sat a squat, thick-chested man, and opposite him the most cadaverously lean fellow that Whistling Dan had ever seen. Before these two Black Bart paused, and then cast a glance over his shoulder towards the master. Whistling Dan frowned in wonder. He knew neither of the pair, but Black Bart apparently did. He slouched a pace closer, crouched, and bared his fangs with a tremendous snarl. At this the lean man left his chair and sprang back to a distance. Terror convulsed his face, but his eyes glittered with a fascinated interest, and he glanced first at his companion and then at the great wolf dog, as if he were making a comparison between them. It was the broad-shouldered man who first spoke. "Partner," he said in a thick voice, in which the articulation was almost lost, "maybe you'd better take your dog out before he gets hurt. He don't like me, and I don't like him none too much." "Bart," called Dan Barry. But Black Bart gave no heed. There had been a slight flexing of his muscles as he crouched, and now he leaped, a black bolt of fighting weight, squarely in the face of the giant. He was met and checked midway in his spring, for the two long arms darted out, two great hands fastened in the throat of the beast, and Black Bart fell back upon the floor, with Mac Strann following, his grip never broken by the fall. A scurry of many feet running towards the scene, a shouting of 20 voices around him, but all that Whistling Dan saw were the fangs of Bart as they gnashed fruitlessly at the wrists of Mac Strann, and then the great red tongue lolling out and the eyes bulging from their sockets. All he heard was the snarling of the wolf and the peculiar whine of rage which came from the throat of the man-beast fighting the wolf. Then he acted. His hands darted between the thick forearms of Mac Strann, his elbows jerked out and snapped the grip. Next he dragged Black Bart away from the danger. The wolf was instantly on his feet and lunging again, but a sharp "heel" from Dan checked him mid-leap. He came to a shuddering halt behind the legs of his master. Whistling Dan slipped a little closer to the giant. "I should have knowed you before," he said in a voice which carried only to the ears of Strann. "You're the brother of Jerry Strann, and they's a reason why Bart hates you, partner." The thick upper lip of Strann lifted slightly as he spoke. "Him or you and your wolf dog together, or one by one, it don't make no difference to me. I've come for you, Barry." The other straightened a little, and his eyes traveled slowly up and down the form of Strann. "I've been hungering to meet a man like you," he said. "Hungering, partner. North of town they's the old McDuffie place, all in ruins, and nobody ever near it. I'll be there in an hour, my friend." "I'll be waiting for you there," nodded Mac Strann, and so saying he turned back to his table as if he had been interrupted by nothing more than a casual greeting. Still Dan Barry remained a moment with his eyes on the face of Mac Strann, and when he turned and walked with his light, soundless step down the length of the silent barroom, the wolf dog slunk at his heels, ever and anon swinging his head over his shoulder and glancing back at the giant at the end of the room. As the door closed on man and dog, the saloon broke once more into murmur, and then into an excited clamoring. Pale Annie stepped from behind the bar and leaned upon the table beside Mac Strann. Even while leaning in this manner the bartender was as tall as the average man. He waved back the others with a gesture of his tremendous arm. Then he reached out and took the hand of Mac Strann in his clammy fingers. "My friend," said the ex-undertaker in his careful manner, "I seen a man once, California, a husky 2-year-old, which nobody said could be done. And I've seen some other things, but I've never seen anything to touch the way you handled Black Bart. Do you know anything about that dog?" Mac Strann shook his ponderous head, and his dull eyes considered Pale Annie with an expression of almost living curiosity. "Black Bart has a record behind him that an old-time gunman would have heard with envy. There are dead men in the record of that dog, sir." All this he had spoken in a comparatively loud voice, but now, noting that the others had heeded his gesture and had made back towards the bar to drink on the strength of that strange fight between man and beast, the bartender approached his lips close to the ear of the giant. He said in a rapid murmur: "I watched you talking with Dan Barry, and I saw Barry's face when he went out. You and he are to meet somewhere again today. My friend, don't throw yourself away." Here Mac Strann stared down at his mighty hand, a significant answer, but Pale Annie went on swiftly: "Yes, you're strong, but strength won't save you from Dan Barry. We know him here in Elkhead. Do you know that if he had pulled his gun and shot you down right here where you sit, that he could have walked out of this room without a hand raised to stop him? Yes, sir. And why? Because we know his record, and I'd rather go against a wolf with my bare hands as you did than stand up against Dan Barry with guns. I could tell you how he fought Jim Silent's gang 1 to 6. I could tell you a lot of other things. My friend, I will tell you about 'em if you'll listen." But Mac Strann considered the speaker with his dull eyes. "I was never much on talkin'," he observed mildly. "I don't understand talkin' very well." Pale Annie started to speak again, but checked himself, stared earnestly at Mac Strann, and then hurried back behind the bar. His face was even graver than usual, but business was business with Pale Annie, and all men have to die in their time. Haw Haw Langley took the place which Pale Annie had left vacant opposite Mac Strann. He cast a frightened glance upward, where the rain roared steadily on the roof of the building. Then his eyes fluttered back until they rested on the face of his companion. He had to moisten his thin lips before he could speak, and even then it was a convulsive effort, like a man swallowing too large a morsel. "Well," said Haw Haw, "is it fixed?" "It's fixed," said Mac Strann. "Maybe you'd get the hosses, Haw Haw, if you're comin' with me." A dark shadow swept over the face of Haw Haw Langley. "You're going to beat it?" he sneered. "After you come all this way you're going to run away from Barry, and him not half your size?" "I'm going out to meet him," answered Mac Strann. Haw Haw Langley started up as if he feared Mac Strann would change his mind if there were any delay. His long fingers twisted together as if to bring the blood into circulation about the purple knuckles. "I'll have the horses right around to the front," he said, "by the time you got your slicker on, Mac. I'll have 'em around in front." And then he stalked swiftly from the room. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 39. The Storm. When they rode out of the town, the wet sand squashed under the feet of their horses and splashed up on their riding boots and their slickers. It even spotted their faces here and there, and a light brown spray darted out to right and left of the falling hoofs. For all the streets of Elkhead were running shallow rivers, with dark, swift currents, and when they left the little town the landscape was shut out by the falling torrents. It made a strange and shifting panorama, for the rain varied in its density now and again, and as it changed, hills which had been quite blotted out leaped close upon them, like living things, and then sprang back again into the mist. So heavy was that tropical fall of water that the horses were bothered by the beating of the big drops, and shook their heads and stamped fretfully under the ceaseless bombardment. Indeed, when one stretched out his hand, the drops stung him, as if with lashes of tiny whips. There was no wind, no thunder, no flash of lightning, only the tremendous downpour which blended earth and sky in a drab, swift river. The air was filled with parallel lines, as in some pencil drawings, not like ordinary rain, but as if the sky had changed into a vast watering spout and was sending down a continuous flood from a myriad holes. It was hard to look up through the terrific downpour, for it blinded one and whipped the face and made one breathless. But now and again a puff of the rare wind would lift the sodden brim of the sombrero, and then one caught a glimpse of the low-hanging clouds, with the nearest whiff of black mist dragging across the top of a hill. Without noticeable currents of wind, The mass of clouds was shifting slowly, with a sort of rolling motion, across the sky, and the weight of the rain forced the two to bend their heads and stare down to where the face of the earth was alive with the gliding brown waters whose surface was thrashed into a continual foam. To speak to each other through the uproar they had to cup their hands about their lips and shout. Then again the rainfall around them fell away to a drizzling mist, and the beating of the downpour sounded far away, and they were surrounded by distant walls of noise. So they came to the McDuffie place. It was a helpless ruin, long abandoned. Not an iota of the roof remained. The sheds for the horses had dropped to the earth, but the walls of the house still remained standing, in part, with the empty windows looking out with a mocking promise of the shelter which was not within. Upon this hollow shack the rain beat with redoubled fury, and even before they could make out the place through the blankets of rain, they heard the hollow drumming, for there were times, oddly enough, when any sound would carry a great distance through the crashing of the rain. A wind now sprung up, and at once veered the rain from its perpendicular fall. It slashed them in the face under the drooping brims of their sombreros, so they drew into the shelter of the highest part of the standing wall. Still, some of the rain struck them, but the major part of it was shunted over their heads. Moreover, the wall acted as a sort of sounding board, catching up every odd noise from the storm-beaten plain beyond. They could speak to each other now, without effort. "Do you think," asked Haw Haw Langley, pressing his reeking horse a little closer to Mac Strann, "that he'll come out after us in a rain like this?" But simple-minded Mac Strann lifted his head and peered through the thick curtains of rain. "Do you think," he parried, "that Jerry could maybe look through all this and see what I'm doing today?" It made Haw Haw Langley grin, but peering more closely and observing that there was no mockery in the face of the giant, he wiped out his grin with a scrubbing motion of his wet hand and peered closely into the face of his companion. "There ain't no doubt of it," he answered reassuringly. "He'll know what you do, Mac. What was it that Pale Annie said to you?" "Wanted me not to meet Barry. Said that Barry had once cleaned up a gang of 6. And here we are, only 2. You ain't going to fight," warned Mac Strann sharply. "It'll be man to man, Haw Haw." "But he might not notice that," cried Haw Haw, and he caressed his scrawny neck as though he already felt fingers closing about his windpipe. "Him being used to fight crowds, Mac. Did you think of that?" "I never asked you to come," responded Mac Strann. "Mac," cried Haw Haw in a sudden alarm, "suppose you wasn't to win? Suppose you wasn't able to keep him away from me?" The numb lips of Mac Strann sprawled into an ugly smile, but he made no other answer. "You don't think you'll lose?" hurried on Haw Haw. "But neither did them 6 that Pale Annie was talking about, most like. But they did. They lost. But if you lose, what'll happen to me?" "There ain't no call for you to stay here," said Mac Strann with utter indifference. Haw Haw answered quickly: "I wouldn't go. I wouldn't miss it for nothing. Ain't I come all this way to see it? I mean to help. Would I fall down on you now, Mac? No, I wouldn't." And twisting those bony fingers together, he burst once more into that rattling, unhuman laughter which all the 3 B's knew so well and dreaded as the dying dread the sight of the circling buzzard above. "Stop laughing!" cried Mac Strann with sudden anger. "Damn you, stop laughing!" The other peered upon Mac Strann with incredulous delight, his broad mouth gaping to that thirsting grin of enjoyment. "You ain't getting nervous, Mac?" he queried, and thrust his face closer to make sure. "You ain't bothered, Mac? You ain't doubting how this'll turn out?" There was no answer, and so he replied to himself: "I know what done it to you. I seen it myself. It was that yaller light in his eyes, Mac. My God, it come up there out of nothing, and it wasn't a light that ought to come into no man's eyes. It was like I woke up at night with a cold weight on my chest and found 2 snake's eyes glittering close to my face. Makes me shivery like, just to think of it now. D'you notice that, Mac?" "I'm tired of talking," said Mac Strann hoarsely. "Damn tired." And so saying he swung his great head slowly around and glared at Haw Haw. The latter shrank away with an undulatory motion in his saddle, and when the head of Mac Strann turned away again the broad mouth began gibbering. "It's getting him like it done me. He's scared, scared, scared. Even Mac Strann." He broke off, for Mac Strann had jerked up his head and said in a strangely muffled voice: "What was that?" The bullet head of Haw Haw Langley leaned to one side and his glittering eyes rolled up while he listened. "Nothin'," he said. "I don't hear nothin'." "Listen again," cried Mac Strann in that same cautious voice, as of one whispering in the night in the house of the enemy. "It's like a voice in the wind. It comes down the wind. Do you hear now? Now? Now?" It was indeed the faintest of faint sounds when Haw Haw caught it. It was in the roar of the rain, as indistinct as some distant light on the horizon which may come from either a rising star or from the window of a house. But it had a peculiar quality of its own, even as the house light would be tinged with yellow when the stars are cold and white. A small and distant sound, and yet it cut through the crashing of the storm more and more clearly. Someone rode through the rain whistling. "It's him!" gasped Haw Haw Langley. "My God A'mighty, Mac, he's whistling! It ain't possible!" He reined his horse closer to the wall, listening with mouth agape. He shrilled suddenly: "What if he should hit us both, seeing us together? There ain't no heart in a feller that can whistle in a storm like this." But Mac Strann had lowered his head bulldog like, and now he listened and thrust out his blunt jaw farther and farther and returned no answer. "God gimme the grit to stick it out," begged Haw Haw Langley in an agony of desire. "God, lemme see how it comes out. God, lemme watch 'em fight. One of 'em's goin' to die. Maybe two of 'em. Nothin' like it has ever been seen." The rain shifted, and the heart of the storm rolled far away. For the moment they could look far out across the shadow swept hills, and out of the heart of the desolate landscape the whistling ran thrilling upon them. It was so loud and close that of one accord the two listeners jerked their heads about and stared at each other, and then turned their eyes as hastily away, as though terrified by what they had seen, each in the face of the other. It was no idle tune which they heard whistled. It was the rising, soaring paean of delight. It rang down upon the wind. It cut into their faces like drops of the rain. It branded itself like freezing cold into their foreheads. And then, upon the crest of the nearest hill, Haw Haw Langley saw a dim figure through the mist, a man on a horse, and something else running in front, and they came swiftly. "It's the wolf that's running us down!" screamed Haw Haw Langley. "Oh, God Almighty, even if we was want to run, the wolf would come and pull us down. Mac, will you save me? Will you keep the wolf away?" He clung to the arm of his companion, but the other brushed him back with a violence which almost unseated Haw Haw. "Keep off'n me," growled Mac Strann, "because when you touch me it feels like something dead was next to my skin. Keep off'n me." Haw Haw dragged himself back into the saddle with effort, for it was slippery with rain, his face convulsed with something black as hate. "It ain't long you'll do that ordering and be so free with your hands. He's comin' soon, Mac. I'd like to stay. I'd like to see the finish." He stopped, his buzzard eyes glittering against the face of the giant. The rain blotted out the figure of the coming horseman, and at the same instant the whistling leaped close upon them. It was as if the whistling man had disappeared at a place where the rain swallowed his form and had taken body again at their very side. Mac Strann shrank back against the wall, bracing his shoulders, and gripped the butts of his guns. But Haw Haw Langley cast a frightened glance on either side, his head making bird-like pecking motions, and then he leaned over the pommel of his saddle with a wail of despair and spurred off into the rain. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 40. The Arroyo. He disappeared instantly in that shivering curtain of grayness. Max Strand sat by the ruined house alone. Now, in a time of danger, a child will give courage to the strong man. There is a wonderful communion between any two in time of crises, and when Haw Haw Langley disappeared through the rain, it was to Max Strand as it was to Patroclus when Apollo struck the base of his neck and his armor of proof fell from him. Not only was there a singular sense of nakedness, but it seemed to him also that the roaring of the rain became a hostile voice of threatening at the same instant. He had never in his life feared any living thing, but now there was a certain hollowness in the region of his stomach, and his heart fluttered like a bird in the air, with appalling lightness, and he wished to be far away. With the clear heaven above him, aye, that would be different, but God had arranged this day, and had set the earth like a stage in readiness for a death, and that was why the rain lashed the earth so fiercely. He looked down. After his death the wind would still continue to beat that muddy water to foam. Aye, in that very place all would be as it was at this moment. He would be gone, but the sky and the senseless earth would remain unchanged. A sudden yearning seized him for the cabin among the mountains, with the singing of the coffee pot over the fire, the good, warm, yellow fire that smoked between the rocks, and the skins he had left leaning against the wall of the cabin to dry. He remembered them all in one glance of memory. Why was he here then, when he should have been so far away, making his roof snug against this torrent of rain? Now, there would be no rain, surely, in those kindly mountains. Their tall peaks would shut out the storm clouds. Only this plain, these low hills, were the place of hell. He swung the head of his horse to one side, drove deep the spurs, and leaning his head to the volleying of the rain, he raced in a direction opposite to that in which Haw Haw Langley had disappeared, in a direction that led as straight as the line of a flying bird towards that cabin in the mountains. Now and then the forefeet of his great horse smashed into a pool and sent a muddy shower of rain flying up. It crackled against his slicker. It beat like hands against his face. Everything was striving, all the elements of wind and rain, to hold him back. Yet flight brought a blessed sense of relief and of safety. He eased the pace of his horse to a moderate gallop, and no longer driving blindly through the hills, he made out, by peering into the blast of rain, some of the pools which lay in his path, and swung aside to avoid them. The rain lightened again about him. He caught a view of the kindly sheltering hills on all sides, but as he urged his horse on towards them, a shrill flight of whistling fell upon his ears from behind. He drew his horse at once to a halt and listened with his heart knocking at his teeth. It was impossible, manifestly, that the fellow could have followed his track through the rain. For that matter, if the wolf fiend could follow traces over a plain awash with water, why might they not as well follow the tracks of Haw Haw Langley? There was no good reason. The whistling? Well, the whistler was far away in the heart of the storm, and the sound was merely blown against the wind by a chance echo. Yet he remained holding his rein taut, and listening with all his might. It came again, suddenly as before, sharp and keen as a shaft of light in the blackest heart of night, and Max Strand leaned over the pommel of his saddle with a groan, and drove his spurs home. At the same instant the rain shut in over the hills again. A fresher wind sprang up and drove the downpour into his face. Also, its roar shut out the possibility of any sound reaching him from behind. He was the worse for that. As long as the whistling might reach him, he could tell how near the pursuer rode. But in this common roar of the rain, the man might be at any distance behind him, on his very heels indeed. Aye, Dan Barry might rush up upon him from behind. He had seen that black stallion, and he would never forget those graceful, agile lines, that generous breast, wide for infinite wind and the great heart. If the stallion were exerted, it could overtake his own mount as if he were standing still. Not on good footing, perhaps, but in this mucky ground the weight of his horse was terribly against him. He drove the spurs home again. He looked back again and again, piercing the driving mist of rain with starting eyes. He was safe still. The destroyer was not in sight, yet he might be riding close behind that wall of rain. His horse came to a sudden halt, sliding on all 4 feet and driving up a rush of dirty water before him. Even then he had stopped barely in time, for his 4 feet were buried to the knees in water. Before Mac Strann lay a wide arroyo. In ordinary weather it was dry as all the desert around, but now it had cupped the water from miles around and ran bank full, a roaring torrent. On its surface the rain beat with a continual crashing, like axes falling on brittle glass, and the downpour was now so fearful that Mac Strann, for all his peering, could not look to the other side. He judged the current to see if he might swim his horse across, but even while he stared the stump of a cottonwood went whirling down the stream, struck a rock, perhaps, on the bottom, flung its entire bulk out of the water with the impact, and then floundered back into the stream again and whirled instantly out of sight in the sheeted rain. No horse in the world could live through such a current, but the arroyo might turn. He swung his horse and spurred desperately along the bank, keeping his eye upon the bank. No, the stream cut back in a sharp curve and headed him farther and farther in the direction of the pursuer. He brought the mighty horse to another sliding halt and swung about in the opposite direction, for surely there must lie the point of escape. Desperately he rode, for the detour had cost him priceless time, yet it might be made up. Aye, the stream sloped sharply into the direction in which he wished to ride. For distance he could not judge, since seconds were longer than minutes to Mac Strann now. And then the edge of the stream curved back again. He thought it must be a short twist in the line of the arroyo, but following it a little further he came to realize the truth. The arroyo described a wide curve and a sharp one, and to ride down its banks on either side was merely to throw himself into the arms of Whistling Dan. Once he struck his fleshy forehead and then turned with gritting teeth and galloped back for the point at which he had first arrived. To his maddened brain it occurred that the current of the arroyo might by this have somewhat abated. He might now make his way across it. So he halted once more on the bank at that point where the stream doubled back on its course, and once more in an agony studied the force of the current. It seemed so placid at the first glance that he was on the verge of spurring the horse into the wide brown stream, but even as he loosened the reins a gap opened in the middle of the water, widened, whirling at the brim, and drew swiftly into a fierce vortex with a black, deep bottom. Mac Strann tightened his reins again, and then turned his horse and waited. Back the veriest coward against the wall, and he becomes formidable, and Mac Strann was one who had never feared before either man or beast or the powers of the storm. Even now he dreaded no reality, but there dwelt in his mind the memory of how Dan Barry had glared at him in the Gilead saloon, and how a flicker of yellow light had glowed in the man's eyes, a strange and phosphorescent glimmer that might be seen in the darkness of night. When he turned the head of his horse away from the arroyo, he waited as one waits for the coming of a ghost. There was the same chill tingling in his blood. Now the blanket of rain lifted, and shook away to comparative clearness, lifted, and for the first time he could look far away across the plains. Nothing but gray, rain-washed desert met his eyes, and then the whistling broke once more upon him at the crest of a trilling run. Mac Strann strained his eyes through the mist of the storm, and then he saw, vaguely, as a phantom, the form of a horseman rushing swiftly into the very teeth of the wind. The whistle wavered, ended, and in its place the long yell of a wolf cut the air. Mac Strann brandished a ponderous fist in defiance that was half hysterical. Man or beast alone he would meet, but a wolf man! He whirled the horse again and urged him heedlessly into the water. The whirlpool no longer opened before him. It had passed on down the arroyo and left in its wake a comparative calm, so that when the horse took the water he made good progress for some distance, until Mac Strann could see clearly the farther bank of the stream. In his joy he shouted to his horse and swung himself clear from his saddle to lighten the burden. At the same time they struck a heavier current, and it struck them down like a blow from above until the water closed over their heads. It was only for a moment, however. Then they emerged, the horse with courageously pricking ears and snorting nostrils just above the flood. Mac Strann swung clear, gripping the horn of the saddle with one hand, while with the other he hastily divested himself of all superfluous weight. His slicker went first, ripped away from the throat and the shoulders, and whipped off his body by one tug of the current. Next he fumbled at his belt and tossed this also, guns and all, away, striking out with his legs and his free arm to aid the progress that now forged ahead with noticeable speed. The current, to be sure, was carrying them farther down the stream, but they were now almost to the center of the arroyo, and though the water boiled furiously over the back of the horse, they forged steadily close and closer to the safe shore. It was chance that defeated Mac Strann. It came shooting down the river, and he saw it only an instant too late, a log whipping through the surface of the stream as though impelled by a living force, and with arrowy straightness it lunged at them. Mac Strann heaved himself high. He screamed at the horse as though the poor brute could understand his warning, and then the tree trunk was upon them. Fair and square it struck the head of the horse with a thud audible even through the rushing of the stream. The horse went down like lead, and Mac Strann was dragged down beneath the surface. He came up fighting grimly and hopelessly for life, for he was in the very center of the stream now, and the current swept him relentlessly down. There seemed to be hands in the middle of the arroyo, and when he strove to battle his way to the edge of the water the current tangled at his legs and pulled him back. Yet even then he did not fear. It was death, he knew, but at least it was a death fighting against the force of nature rather than destruction at the hands of some weird and unhuman agency. His arms began to grow numb. He raised his head to pick out the nearest point on the shore and made his last struggle for life. What he saw was a black head cutting the water just above him, and beside the horse, one hand upon the beast's mane, swam a man. At the same instant a hand fastened on his collar, and he was drawn slowly against the force of the river. In the stunning surprise of the first moment he could make no effort to save himself, and as a result all three were washed hopelessly down the current. But a shrill warning from his rescuer set him fighting again with all the power of his great limbs. After that they forged steadily towards the shore. The black horse swam with amazing strength, and breaking the force of the current for the men, they soon passed from the full grip of the torrent and forged into the smoother shallows at the side of the stream. In a moment firm land was beneath the feet of Mac Strann, and he turned his dull eyes of amazement upon Dan Barry. The latter stood beside the panting black horse. He had not even thrown off his slicker in the fording of the stream. There had been no time for even that small delay if he wished to save Strann. And now he was throwing back the folds of the garment to leave free play for his arms. He panted from the fierce effort of the fording, but his head was high, a singular smile lingered about the corners of his mouth, and in his eyes Mac Strann saw the gleam of yellow, a signal of unfathomable danger. From his holsters Barry drew two revolvers. One he retained, the other he tossed towards Mac Strann, and the latter caught it automatically. "Now," said the soft voice of Barry, "we're equally armed. Down, Bart!" For the wolf dog was slinking with ominous intent toward the giant. "And there's the dog you shot. If you drop me you can send your next shot into Bart. If I drop you the teeth of Bart will be in your throat. Make your own terms. Fight in the way you want, knives if you like 'em better than guns, or," and here the yellow flamed terribly in Barry's eyes, "bare hand to hand." The grim truth sank slowly home in the dull mind of Mac Strann. The man had saved him from the water to kill him on dry land. "Barry," he said slowly, "it was your bullet that brung down Jerry, but you've paid me back here. There's nothing left on earth worth fighting for. There's your gun." And he threw the revolver into the mud at Barry's feet and turned on his heel and lumbered off into the rain. There was no voice of answer behind him, except a shrill whine of rage from Black Bart, and then a sharp command, "Down!" from the master. As the blanket of rain shut over him, Mac Strann looked back. There stood the strange man with the wolf crouched at his feet, and the teeth of Bart were bared, and the hum of his horrible snarling carried to Strann through the beat of the rain. Mac Strann turned again and plodded slowly through the storm. And Dan Barry? Twice men had stood before him, armed, and twice he had failed to kill. Wonder rose in him, wonder and a great fear. Was he losing the desert? Was the desert losing him? Were the chains of humanity falling about him to drag him down to a tamed and sordid life? A sudden hatred for all men, Mac Strann, Daniels, Kate, and even poor Joe Cumberland, welled hot in the breast of Whistling Dan. The strength of men could not conquer him, but how could their very weakness disarm him? He leaped again on the back of Satan and rode furiously back into the storm. End of chapter 40. #41 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand, Chapter 41. The Falling of Night. It had been hard to gauge the falling of night on this day, and even the careful eyes of the watchers on the Cumberland ranch could not tell when the grayness of the sky was being darkened by the coming of the evening. All day there had been swift alternations of light and shadow, comparatively speaking, as the clouds grew thick or thin before the wind, but at length, indubitably, the night was there. Little by little the sky was overcast, and even the lines of the falling rain were no longer visible. Before the gloom of the darkness had fully settled over the earth, moreover, there came a change in the wind, and the watchers at the rain-beaten windows of the ranch house saw the clouds roll apart and split into fragments that were driven from the face of the sky, and from the clean washed face of heaven the stars shone bright and serene, and still Dan Barry had not come. After the tumult of that long day, the sudden silence of that windless night had more ill omen in it than thunder and lightning, for there is something watching and waiting in silence. In the living room the three did not speak. Now that the storm was gone, they had allowed the fire to fall away until the hearth showed merely fragmentary dances of flame, and a wide bed of dull red coals growing dimmer from moment to moment. Wung Lu had brought in a lamp, a large lamp with a circular wick that cast a bright white light, but Kate had turned down the wick, and now it made only a brief circle of yellow in one corner of the room. The main illumination came from the fireplace and struck on the faces of Kate and Buck Daniels, while Joe Cumberland on the couch at the end of the room was only plainly visible when there was an extraordinarily high leap of the dying flames. But usually his face was merely a glimmering hint in the darkness, his face and the long hands which were folded upon his breast. Often when the flames leapt there was a crackling of the embers and the last of the log, and the two nearer the fire would start and flash a glance, of one accord, towards the prostrate figure on the couch. The silence had lasted so long that when at length the dull voice of Joe Cumberland broke in, there was a ring of a most prophetic solemnity about it. "He ain't come," said the old man. "Dan ain't here." The others exchanged glances, but the eyes of Kate dropped sadly and fastened again upon the hearth. Buck Daniels cleared his throat like an orator. "Nobody but a fool," he said, "would have started out of Elkhead in a storm like this." "Weather makes no difference to Dan," said Joe Cumberland. "But he'd think of his hoss." "Weather makes no difference to Satan," answered the faint oracular voice of Joe Cumberland. "Kate." "Yes." "Is he coming?" She did not answer. Instead she got up slowly from her place by the fire and took another chair far away in the gloom, where hardly a glimmer of light reached to her, and there she let her head rest as if exhausted against the back of the seat. "He promised," said Buck Daniels, striving desperately to keep his voice cheerful, "and he never busts his promises." "Aye," said the old man, "he promised to be back, but he ain't here." "If he started after the storm," said Buck Daniels. "He didn't start after the storm," announced the oracle. "He was out in it." "What was that?" cried Buck Daniels sharply. "The wind," said Kate, "for it's rising. It will be a cold night tonight." "And he ain't here," said the old man monotonously. "Ain't there things that might hold him up?" asked Buck with a touch of irritation. "Aye," said the old rancher, "they's things that'll hold him up. They's things that'll turn a wild dog, too, and the taste of blood is one of 'em." The silence fell again. There was an old clock standing against the wall. It was one of those tall wooden frames in which behind the glass the heavy polished disc of the pendulum alternated slowly back and forth with a wearisome precision, and with every stroke of the seconds there was a faint metallic clangor in the clock, a falter like that which comes in the voice of a very old man, and the sound of this clock took possession of every silence until it seemed like the voice of a doomsman counting off the seconds. Aye, everyone in the room again and again took up the tale of those seconds and would count them slowly, 50, 51, 52, 53, and on, waiting for the next speech or for the next popping of the wood upon the hearth, or the next wail of the wind that would break upon the deadly expectancy of that count. And while they counted each looked straight before him with wide and widening eyes. Into one of these pauses the voice of Buck Daniels broke at length, and it was a cheerless and lonely voice in that large room, in the dull darkness and the duller lights. "Do you remember Shorty Martin, Kate?" "I remember him." He turned in his chair and hitched it a little closer to her until he could make out her face dimly among the shadows. The flames jumped on the hearth, and he saw a picture that knocked at his heart. "The little bow-legged fellow, I mean." "Yes, I remember him very well." Once more the flames sputtered, and he saw how she looked wistfully before her and above. She had never seemed so lovely to Buck Daniels. She was pale indeed, but there was no ugly pinching of her face, and if there were shadows beneath her eyes, they only served to make her eyes seem marvelously large and bright. She was pallid, and the firelight stained her skin with touches of tropic gold and cast a halo of the golden hair about her face. She seemed like one of those statues wrought in the glory and the rich days of Athens in ivory and in gold, some goddess who has heard the tidings of the coming fall, the change of the old order, and sits passive in her throne, waiting the doom from which there is no escape. Something of this filtered through to the sad heart of Buck Daniels. He too had no hope, nay, he had not even her small hope, but somehow he was able to pity her and cherish the picture of her in that gloomy place. It seemed to Buck Daniels that he would give 10 years from the best of his life to see her smile as he had once seen her in those old bright days. He went on with his tale. "You would have busted laughing if you'd seen him at the Circle Y bar roundup the way I seen him. Shorty ain't so bad with a rope. He's always talking about what he can do and how he can daub a rope on anything that's got horns. He ain't so bad, but then again he ain't so good either. Especially ain't so good at riding. You know what bold legs he got, Kate?" "I remember, Buck." She was looking at him at last, and he talked eagerly to turn that look into a smile. "Well, they was the three of us got after one 2-year-old, a bull, and a bad 'un. Shorty was on one side, and me and Cuttle was on the other side. Shorty daubed his rope and made a fair catch, but when his hoss set back the rope busted plumb in two. Now Shorty, he had an idea that he could ease the work of his hoss a whole pile if he laid holt of the rope whenever his hoss set down to flop a cow. So Shorty, he had holt on this rope and was pulling back hard when the rope busted, and Shorty, he spilled backwards out in that saddle like he'd been kicked out. Whilst he's laying there, the bull that had took a header when the rope busted come up on his feet again, and I'll tell a man he was rarin' mad. He seen Shorty lying on the ground, and he took a run for Shorty. Me and Cuttle was laughin' so hard we couldn't barely swing our ropes, but I made a throw and managed to get that bull around both horns. So my Betty sits down and braces herself for the tug. In the meantime little Shorty, he sits up and he lays a hand to his head, and same time he sees that bull come tearing for him. Up he jumps, and just then the bull comes to the end of the line and wonk, down he goes, head over heels, and hits the sand with a bang that must have jostled his liver some, I'll be saying. Well, Shorty, he sees that bull fly up in the air, and he lets out a yell like the world was coming to an end and starts running. If he'd run straight back the other way the bull couldn't have run a step, because I had him fast with my rope. But Shorty seen me, and he comes tearing for my horse to get behind him. The bull was like a cat getting to his feet, and he sights Shorty tearing and lights out after him. There they went lickety-split. That bull was puffing on the seat of Shorty's trousers and tossing his horns and just missing Shorty by inches. And Shorty had his mouth so wide open hollering that you could have thrown a side of beef down his throat, and his eyes were bugging out. Them bow legs of his was stretching 10 yards at a clip, most like, and the boys say that they could hear him hollering a mile away. But that bull, stretch himself all he couldn't gain an inch on Shorty, and Shorty couldn't gain an inch on the bull, till the bull come to the other end of that 40-foot rope, and then whang goes up the heels of the bull and down goes his head, and his heels come over, wonk, and hits Shorty right square on the head. Been an ordinary feller, he wouldn't have lived to talk about it afterwards. Seeing it was Shorty, he just goes up in the air and lands about 10 yards away, rolls over, and hits his feet without once getting off his stride, and then he did start running, and he didn't stop running nor hollering till he got plumb back to the house." Buck Daniels sat back in his chair and guffawed at the memory. In the excitement of the tale he had quite forgotten Kate, but when he remembered her, she sat with her head craned a little to one side, her hand raised for silence, and a smile, indeed, upon her lips, but never a glance for Buck Daniels. He knew at once. "Is it him?" he whispered. "Do you hear him?" "Hush!" commanded 2 voices, and then he saw that old Joe Cumberland was also listening. "No," said the girl suddenly, "it was only the wind." As if in answer, a far, faint whistling broke upon them. She drew her hand slowly towards her breast, as if indeed she drew the sound in with them. "He's coming!" she cried. "Oh, Dad, listen! Don't you hear?" "I do," answered the rancher, "but what I'm hearing don't warm my blood none. Kate, if you're wise you'll get up and go to your room, and don't pay no heed to anything you might be hearing tonight." End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 42. The Journey into Night. There was no doubting the meaning of Joe Cumberland. It grew upon them with amazing swiftness, as if the black stallion were racing upon the house at a swift gallop, and the whistling rose and rang and soared in a wild outburst. Give the eagle the throat of the lark, and after he has struck down his prey in the center of the sky and sent the ragged feathers and the slain body falling down to earth, what would be the song of the eagle rising again and dwindling out of sight in the heart of the sky? What terrible paean would he send whistling down to the dull earth far below? And such was the music that came before the coming of Dan Barry. It did not cease as usual at a distance, but it came closer and closer, and it swelled around them. Buck Daniels had risen from his chair and stolen to a corner of the room where not a solitary shaft of light could possibly reach him, and Kate Cumberland slipped farther into the depths of the big chair. So that in their utter silence, in spite of the whistling that blew in upon them, they could hear the dull ticking of the tall clock, and by a wretched freak of fate the ticking fell exactly in with the soaring rhythm of the whistle, and each had a part in the deadliness of the other. Very near upon them the music ceased abruptly. A footfall swept down the hall. A weight struck the door and cast it wide, and Black Bart glided into the room. He cast not a glance on either side. He turned his head neither to right nor to left, but he held straight on until he came to Kate Cumberland, and there he stood before her. She leaned forward. "Bart," she said softly, and stretched out her hands to him. A deep snarl stopped the gesture, and at the flash of the long fangs she sank into the chair. Old Joe Cumberland, with fearful labor, dragged himself to a sitting position upon the couch, and sitting up in this fashion, the light fell fully upon his white face and his white hair and his white beard, so that he made a ghostly picture. Then an outer door slammed, and a light step, at almost a running pace, speeded down the hall. The door was swung wide again, and Dan was before them. He seemed to bring with him the keen, fresh air of the light, and at the opening of the door the flame in the lamp jumped in its chimney, shook, and fell slowly back to its original dimness. But by that glow of light they saw that the sombrero upon Dan Barry's head was a shapeless mass. His bandana had been torn away, leaving his throat bare. His slicker was a mass of rents, and at the neck had been crumpled and torn in 1,000 places, as though strong teeth had worried it to a rag. Spots of mud were everywhere on his boots, even on his sombrero with its sagging brim, and on one side of his face there was a darker stain. He had ceased his whistling, indeed, but now he stood at the door and hummed as he gazed about the room. Straight to Kate Cumberland he walked, took her hands and raised her from the chair. He said, and there was a fiber and a ring in his voice that made them catch their breaths, "There's something outside that I'm following tonight. I don't know what it is. It is the taste of the wind and the feel of the air and the smell of the ground, and I've got to be riding. I'm saying good-bye for a bit, Kate." "Dan," she cried, "what's happened? What's on your face?" "The mark of the night," he answered. "I don't know what else. Will you come with me, Kate?" "For how long? Where are you going, Dan?" "I don't know where or how long. All I know is I've got to be going. Come to the window. Take the air on your face. You'll understand." He drew her after him and cast up the window. "Do you feel it in the wind?" he called to her, turning with a transfigured face. "Do you hear it?" She could not speak, but stood with her face lifted, trembling. "Look at me," he commanded, and turned her roughly towards him. There he stood leaning close to her, and the yellow light flickered and waned and burned again in his eyes. He held her hands while he stared. Now he dropped them with an exclamation. "You're blank," he said angrily.
You've seen nothing and heard nothing." He turned on his heel. "Bart," he called, and walked from the room, and they heard the padding of his soft step down the hall and on the porch, and then silence. Black Bart slunk to the door and into the hall, but instantly he was back and peering into the gloom of that silent place like an evil-eyed spectre. A sharp whistle rang from outside, and Black Bart started. Still he glided on until he stood before Kate, then turned and stalked slowly towards the door, looking back after her. She did not move, and with a snarl the wolf dog whirled again and trotted back to her. This time he caught a fold of her skirt in his teeth and pulled on it, and under the pressure she made a step. "Kate," called Joe Cumberland, "are you mad, girl, to dream of going out in a night like this?" "I'm not going," she answered hurriedly. "I'm afraid, and I won't leave you, Dad." She had stopped as she spoke, but Black Bart, snarling terribly, threw his weight back and dragged her a step forward. "Buck!" cried old Joe Cumberland, and he dragged himself up and stood tottering. "Shoot that damned wolf, for God's sake, for my sake!" Still the wolf dog drew the girl in that snarling progress towards the door. "Kate!" cried her father, and the agony in his voice made it young and sent it ringing through the room. "Will you go out to wander between heaven and hell on a night like this?" "I'm not going," she answered. "I won't leave you. But oh, Dad!" He opened his lips for a fresh appeal, but the chorus of the wild geese swept in upon the wind, blown loud and clear and jangling as distant bells out of tune. And Kate Cumberland buried her face in her hands and stumbled blindly out of the room and down the hall, and then they heard the wild neighing of a horse outside. "Buck," commanded Joe Cumberland, "he's stealing my girl, my Kate. Go out, call up the boys, tell 'em to stop Dan from saddling a horse for Kate." "Wait and listen," cut in Buck Daniels. "D'you hear that?" On the wet ground outside they heard a patter of galloping hoofs, and then a wild whistling, sweet and keen and high, came ringing back to them. It diminished rapidly with the distance. "He's carrying her off on Satan," groaned Joe Cumberland, staggering as he tried to step forward. "Buck, call out the boys. Even Satan can't beat my hosses when he's carrying double. Call 'em out. If you bring her back—" His voice choked and he stumbled and would have fallen to his knees had not Buck Daniels sprang forward and caught him and carried him back to the couch. "What's happened there ain't no man can stop," said Buck hoarsely. "God's work or the devil's work I dunno, but I know there ain't no place for a man between Dan and Kate." "Turn up the lights," commanded Joe Cumberland sharply. "Got to see. I got to think. D'you hear?" Buck Daniels ran to the big lamp and turned up the wick. At once a clear light flooded every nook of the big room and showed all its emptiness. "Can't you make the lamp work?" asked the old ranchman angrily. "Ain't there any oil in it? Why, Buck, there ain't enough light for me to see your face hardly. But I'll do without the light, Buck. How far will they go? Kate's a good girl. She won't leave me, lad." "She won't," agreed Buck Daniels. "Just gone with Dan for a bit of a canter." "The devil was come back into his eyes," muttered the old man. "God knows where he's heading for, Buck. I bought him in off the range and made him a part of my house. I took him into my heart, and now he's gone out again and taken everything that I love along with him. Buck, why did he go?" "He'll come back," said the big cowpuncher softly. "It's getting darker and darker," said Joe Cumberland, "and they's a kind of ringing in my ears. Talk louder. I don't hear you none too well." "I said they was coming back," said Buck Daniels. Something like a light showed on the face of Joe Cumberland. "Ay, lad," he said eagerly, "I can hear Dan whistlin' comin' back, nearer and nearer. Most like he was just playin' a joke on me, eh, Buck?" "Most like," said Buck brokenly. "And there it's ringing at the door of the house. Was that a footstep on the hall?" "It was," said Buck. "They's comin' down the hall." But far, far away he heard the whistling of Dan Barry dying among the hills. "You let the lamp go out," said Joe Cumberland, "and now I can't see nothing. Are they in the room?" "They're here," said Buck Daniels, "coming towards you now." Dan!" cried the old man, shading his eyes and peering anxiously. "No, I can't see a thing. Can you find me, lad?" And Buck Daniels, softening his voice as much as he could, answered: "I can find you." "Then gimme your hand." Buck Daniels slipped his own large hand into the cold fingers of the dying cattleman. An expression of surpassing joy lay on the face of Joe Cumberland. "Whistlin' Dan, my Dan," he murmured faintly. "I'm kind of sleepy. But before I go to sleep tonight I got to tell you that I forgive you for your joke, pretending to take Kate away. There's nothing but sleep worth while, and going to sleep holding your hand, lad." Buck Daniels dropped upon his knees and stared into the wide, dead eyes. Through the open window a sound of whistling blew to him. It was a sweet, faint music, and being so light it seemed like a chorus of singing voices among the mountains, for it was as pure and as sharp as the starlight. Buck Daniels lifted his head to listen, but the sound faded, and the murmur of the night wind came between.
End of chapter 42.
Recording by rkilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Night Horseman by Max Brand.